life. So we see it out of the scripture that we read. Pontius Pilate has gone to Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate, if you can remember the story at all, he said, "This man has done no wrong. He hasn't done anything wrong at all." And yet they still wanted to crucify him. The crowd was yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." The religious leaders were all begging Pontius Pilate, "Have him crucified." And Pilate still wouldn't do it. And he said, but then the crowd started calling out, "How about you give us Barabbas? Exchange for us." So that's what happened. Pontius Pilate agreed to that. And instead of having this criminal Barabbas executed, instead of having this person that deserved execution, Jesus took his place and was executed in the place of Barabbas. But right here we see that Jesus is flogged, he is humiliated. And I want to explain what this passage means in a little more detail so that you can try to visualize it. Many of us have seen Mel Gibson's account of The Passion of the Christ, the movie that came out many years ago. And it's pretty graphic, this part. Of all the scenes, this is by far the most graphic. And it was very likely that this is somewhat of what happened. But first, he was physically tortured. And he was led into the courtyard of the palace. He was tied to a post that would have probably been about this high, in which he would just leaned over. And he was whipped with various things. There was a torture thing that some of you might be familiar with. It was called the cat of nine tails. And it would be a small whip about this long. But on the very end would be pieces of glass and shards of metal. So that when it would hit your skin, it would literally pull your skin off. And Jesus had this happen to him. Another translation, whenever it says they called together the whole company of soldiers, that means the whole cohort of soldiers. And that was a special formation of soldiers that included 600 Roman soldiers. So we know at least 600 men were surrounding Jesus as he was being beaten and humiliated. Not to mention the crowds that were already there. But the people that would beat him were a select few Roman soldiers that were, their specialty was torture. And they were specially trained to torture people that were getting ready to be executed. But they were trained so that when they hurt them and beat them, that they would bring them just to the point of death, but wouldn't kill them. That was their specialty. Some people were, car salesmen and potter people, but these people, what they did for a living was torture people. And they tortured Jesus. After he was beaten, you can just imagine what that was like. I'll give you a passage here in a few moments that will sort of so we can try to visualize this. But after that, he was humiliated. You can imagine Jesus being beaten to a pulp, really. And then after he was untied from the post on which he was beaten, he was clothed in a purple cloak. The Gospel of Matthew tells us it was a scarlet cloak, but it could have been red, but Mark uses the word purple for a special reason because it meant royalty. And then they put a crown of thorns on his head. And in the land of Israel, there are very small trees that grow. It's a very dry place. Much of it's desert land. So the trees that grow in desert aren't tall trees like we see outside, but they're very small trees. And even when I was over winter break, I went to Texas to see some family to West Texas, which is very dry. And I did not see one tree probably over 8 foot tall. And this is probably much like what the land of Israel is like. But there is a certain tree that grows that is covered in thorns. And it's like vines wrapped around it, covered in thorns. So what the Roman soldiers did was take one of these vines that were covered in thorns and cut it off and twisted it into a crown and put it on his head. Then they put a staff in his hand, the mark again of royalty. And then Matthew tells us that they beat him with reeds. Now, the part of being beaten with reeds wasn't physical torture. It probably didn't hurt too badly. But it's sort of like being spanked. Now, the purpose of being spanked really isn't the pain. You don't spank your children so that you can physically hurt them, but so that you do it so that they can learn a lesson. That is sort of a thing that just no one really wants to go through. And this is what happened to Jesus. But then these 600 men that were around Jesus began to spit on him. Began to bow down to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews." Laugh in his face. Can you imagine? And this whole time, Jesus is at the point of death. It's a pretty horrible thing to try to imagine. Every sermon I've given in this sermon series, I've invited you to try to see yourself as somebody in the story. And this morning, I want you to try to see yourself as one of the guards. If you were a Roman soldier at this time, if you were there in that place, if your commanding officer told you to embarrass this man as much as you possibly could, would you do it?